Welcome, everyone. My name is Jim Goodrich of Continuous Process Improvement Systems. I'd like to thank George Chow of Mannix for his collaboration on this presentation. Today's session starts with NIST 800-171 Requirement 3.14, which is a key requirement for CMMC Level 2 certification as one of the access controls. We'll explain that requirement along with tools and best practices to help assure compliance. Control 3.1.4 is part of the access control family, and it requires organizations to separate duties among individuals to minimize the risk that a single person could misuse their authorization for malicious acts without colluding with others. 3.14a, the duties of individuals requiring separation are defined. We need to document those duties. 3.1.4b, responsibilities for duties that require separation are assigned to separate individuals. C, access privileges that enable individuals to exercise the duties that require separation are granted to separate individuals. What does this do for us? It helps us prevent fraud, errors, and unauthorized actions. This classic security principle helps prevent fraud and mistakes by ensuring that no one has unchecked power over critical operations. This aligns with best practices in both government and industry for mitigating insider threats and reducing opportunity for abuse. Interpreting 3.1.4, what does it all mean? Well, don't allow a single individual control over all aspects of critical tasks. Separating duties means that dividing critical responsibilities so multiple people are involved in sensitive processes. This gives us a check and balances. For instance, the person who creates user accounts should not be the same person who approves access or audits usage. Financially, the employee who initiates a payment should not be the one who authorizes it or reconciles it. This separation makes it more difficult for an insider to conduct fraud or to sabotage systems unnoticed. Let's look at the assessment objectives. Objectively determine if share of duties is enforced. Assess both policy and technical controls. Interview staff, review system documentation, and observe operations. NIST 800-171A provides the assessment procedures for assessors of this control. Assessors examine if your policies and procedures specify duty separation, if your technical configurations reflect this separation, and if your staff understand their specific roles and responsibilities. This holistic approach ensures that both design and implementation are sound, and if they are actually followed in daily operations. Let's look at some common IT and business tasks that require separation. For example, the administrator who sets up new accounts should not approve their own work. The individual who grants privileged access should not audit themselves. Similarly, you may want to separate the patch installer from the one authorizing updates. And ideally, those who monitor logs are different from those who audit for suspicious activities. Recognizing these areas is the first step toward implementing effective separation of duties. When using a cloud environment like Microsoft Government Community Cloud, or GCC, some controls are managed by Microsoft, especially at the infrastructure and platform levels. However, separation of duties within your own tenant is still your responsibility as an organization. This means while Microsoft ensures that their staff cannot abuse their privileges at the platform level, you're responsible for defining and configuring roles, access, and approval processes within your organization's tenant. Let's look at the shared responsibilities with Microsoft GCC. Microsoft's responsibilities include hardware, the hypervisor, and platform security. Microsoft secures the underlying infrastructure and enforces its own staff's duty separation. Excuse me. However, you as the customer assign roles in Azure AD or Entra ID, enforce who can create versus approve access, and establish monitoring and audit practices within your cloud systems. Some duties are shared, such as responding to security incidents. Microsoft may alert you, but you must investigate and remediate as appropriate in your own environment. In order to implement 3.1.4 for separation of duties, start by pinpointing which functions are sensitive. Things like access management, financial approvals, or key system changes. Map which employees who have responsibilities. In the cloud, utilize RBAC or role-based access control to minimize privileges and assign separate roles for creation, approval, and review of tasks. Leverage built-in workflow and approval processes, like in Microsoft 365, Azure, or Entra ID, and be sure to regularly review who has which rights to keep duties properly separated as your organization evolves. What are some examples of separation of duties within Microsoft 365? In practice, this might mean using specialized built-in roles within Microsoft 365, Azure, or Entra ID. For example, the user management admin can create or edit accounts, but the global reader only views details for auditing, not changing them. Meanwhile, the compliance data admin might review audit logs, but cannot tamper with them. Features like Azure ID or Entra ID and privileged identity management let you set up approval workflows so no single admin can grant themselves excessive privileges unsupervised. What are some of the organizational procedures for 3.1.4? Well, let's start by documenting staff roles and duties. Formalizing separation of duties starts with clear documentation. Spell out who does what. Ensure that standard operating procedures clearly divide steps among different people, especially for access, changes, and approvals. And regularly review all access and roles, ideally annually, if not more often. Any exceptions, for example, in a very small organization, should have explicit documented approval from management along with compensating controls. 3.1.4 separation of duties, procedures, and policies. They should include written information security policy, or more specifically an access control policy defining separation of duties for your organization. So your policy framework will include explicit language mandating the separation of duties. This appears in the access control policy and also in your access control procedures and change management processes. There should be documentation of how duties are divided, how exceptions are authorized, and how reviews are conducted, as well as logs of approvals and changes. Let's look at potential assessment considerations. An assessor for CMMC Level 2 certification will interview relevant staff to ensure they understand their roles and why duties are separated. They'll review your documented procedures. They'll look at records of account creations and access grants, and they'll check for sample evidence of proper separation. For instance, showing that one person requested an account, but another person approved it. If you have any exceptions, assessors will look for approved documentation and compensating controls in place. Let's look at more evidence that an assessor may request. To prove compliance, you need evidence such as organization charts, which show role separation, documented policies and procedures, completed approval forms for access or changes, records of periodic access reviews, and audit logs that demonstrate that different individuals perform key steps. These artifacts are critical during a CMMC or NIST 800-171 assessment for Control 314 separation of duties. For any of the 110 controls, NIST 800-171A outlines 4 main types of assessment: examine, interview, test, and review. Assessors will review your documentation or examine your documentation, interview your staff, or test out actual workflows. And they'll review records of access or change approvals and audit logs. This is all to make sure that your system is completely compliant for separation of duties. Let's pause for any questions you might have. Hello again. My name is Jim Goodrich of Continuous Process Improvement Systems in collaboration with George Chow and Manex Consulting. This session focuses on NIST 800-171 Requirement 3.1.5, which is another key practice for access control and CMMC Level 2 certification and compliance. We'll explain the requirement along with tools and best practices to help assure compliance. Employ the principle of least privilege, including for specific security functions and privileged accounts. Least privilege guidance states, permit authorized users to access systems and processes necessary to accomplish assigned tasks in accordance with organizational missions and business functions. This means organizations must ensure that users have access to the information and resources necessary for their job, but no more than that. And that's the key, no more than that. Essentially, this requirement is the principle of least privilege. Access is not assigned for convenience. Rather, it's tailored based on business need. So 315A, privileged accounts are identified. This means they're documented. 315B, access to privileged accounts is authorized in accordance with the principle of least privilege. Remember, least privilege means having permissions and access to only the systems and processes, which includes the data, the rights, and the accounts that are needed to do the assigned job. 315C, security functions are identified. These include IT administrators and facility security. And 315D states that access to security functions is authorized, again in accordance with the principle of least privilege. The requirement states, permit authorized users to access systems and processes necessary to accomplish assigned tasks in accordance with organizational missions and business functions, but no more. Essentially, this is the requirement of least privilege. Let's continue to discuss the least privileged access. It's that important for secure CUI systems. The principle behind least privilege 315 is, again, restricting access to only what's needed. Why is this so important? Excessive access can lead to inadvertent data leaks, internal threats, or unintentional or intentional misuse of CUI. 1. Authorized users. Only those with explicit approval should access systems relevant to their responsibilities. 2. Assigned tasks. Access should be mapped to discrete job functions or roles or tasks. 3. Systems and processes. The control applies not only to data, but also to applications, services, networks, and processes involved in handling CUI. Remember, it's not so much about restricting work, it's about enabling roles while protecting sensitive data. Let's talk about assessment objectives for 315 least privilege. Assessment objectives are really the detail behind each of the 110 controls or practice requirements. For 315, employing the principle of least privilege, the objectives are to determine if authorized users are identified, access aligns with tasks and business functions, and users are only given access as necessary. Assessors will interview the staff, they'll recommend or they'll review, they won't recommend, they'll review documented access policies and procedures, and they'll check your technical configurations. For example, do you maintain lists of all users and their authorized resources? You'll need to. Are user role assignments and access rights reviewed regularly? And is there evidence that unnecessary access is removed promptly? Now let's look at shared responsibility in the Microsoft Government Community Cloud environment. Many DoD contractors use Microsoft GCC or GCC High. Microsoft provides a secure, compliant, technical baseline, but the shared responsibility model means that Microsoft handles some controls while you own others as an organization. Let's break those down a little. Microsoft's responsibilities include the physical data center security, the hosted infrastructure, in effect separation of tenants for this particular control, and some baseline access control mechanisms, including built-in authentication. You as a customer and organization have other responsibilities, including configuring roles, permissions, and groups, implementing least privilege within your tenant, and managing user onboarding and offboarding, and creating or maintaining documentation. In effect, system security plans that show access policies. You'll also be responsible for performing periodic reviews of access rights, especially as roles change. So, while GCC provides tools to enforce 315 for least privilege, configuration and even day-to-day enforcement is up to your IT and compliance teams. Let's walk through a specific example in Microsoft GCC. RBAC, or Role-Based Access Control, allows you to set up who can do what in your Microsoft GCC tenant by assigning permissions according to job roles. You can assign CUI project staff to a dedicated Azure AD group or Entra ID group with restricted SharePoint library access. PIM, or Privileged Identity Management, lets you provide just-in-time privileged access and monitor usage. Remember, privileged access is that for your administrators, not just your CUI users. So, elevated permissions are only granted when truly needed. Microsoft provides and maintains these frameworks, but you must design the roles carefully. Make sure those roles are very carefully thought out. Assign them, activate PIM, and conduct periodic reviews. You can also configure privileged identity management so an engineer only gets administrative rights when they request and justify it for a temporary window or period of time. Entra ID and access reviews. After permissions are set for only authorized users, IT Security Administration sets up quarterly access reviews in Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. In this, they review group membership, document results, and make necessary removals. To prepare for compliance review and certification, you may want to take screenshots and record these changes as artifacts for your compliance package. Microsoft Purview supports your compliance efforts by giving you tools for monitoring, for data classification, and for auditing activities related to user privileges. This can occur at the end device level, which makes Purview especially important. Although Microsoft enables this auditing technology, you as an organization are responsible for running reports, for reviewing access logs, and for detecting excessive privileges and adjusting roles as needed, continually ensuring that least privilege is maintained for CMMC Level 2, 3.1.5. Implementing requirement 315, least privilege, in your Microsoft GCC environment involves several best practices. 1. Role-based access control. As an organization, you need to map users to roles based on their job functions. Use Azure AD or Entra ID security groups or Microsoft Teams with tightly scoped permissions. Just-in-time and just enough access. Use Azure ID or Entra ID and privileged identity management for elevated access with time limits. Remember to remove any global admin access unless it's absolutely required. Regular access reviews. This is very important. Set up Microsoft Access Reviews feature to periodically check and to update group memberships and permissions. Documentation is always important. Document each review outcome as well. Let's talk about separation of duties. No single person should control multiple critical areas or aspects of CUI systems. And finally, provisioning and deprovisioning. Have defined onboarding and offboarding processes with checklists. Ensure disabling or deleting accounts as employees leave or roles change. And again, remember to document these processes in your SSP for transparency during assessments. Continuous monitoring and improvement. Very important for each of the controls and for 315 least privilege. This is not a one and done project. Continuing monitoring ensures ongoing compliance and risk reduction. Remember, quarterly access reviews through Microsoft tools are very important. Annual policy and procedure refresh is important. Regular audits and log reviews is something strictly needed. Prompt reporting and remediation of access anomalies is something that must be reviewed to be updated quickly. This creates a security-first culture and will make for a smoother assessment. Okay, what else should your organization have in place and be documented, customized exactly for your organization? Access management policy. What does this do for 315? It defines least privilege, approval requirements, exceptions, and emergency access. User provisioning and deprovisioning workflow. What does this do? It shows the assignment of responsibility for user setup and timely removal. Access review schedule. Why is this important? A frequency is required to be set up by you as an organization. Quarterly or semi-annually is recommended. And this also defines who is the responsible party for that access review. Incident response procedure. We'll talk quite a bit more about this in later controls, but it's also important for least privilege. Basically, what to do if unauthorized access is detected. Okay, for change management process, this ensures that role changes or department transfers trigger access updates. Remember, procedures must be communicated to IT, HR, and managers responsible for CUI. Your business process is very important here, but it needs to work with the security restrictions and compliance restrictions for CUI. And again, procedures and assessment considerations. What will an assessor review? We've talked a lot about documentation. All documentation is important for CUI systems, but we know assessors will look for certain things when auditing these controls. They'll look for your policies and procedures documentation. This is evidence that procedures exist and are communicated to the staff and practiced by the staff. User access listings. Are those user access lists up to date? That should show who has access to what and again be up to date. Access review records. Track and review audits of user accounts and changes to access. Ticketing or change management records. This is documentation showing user access requests, approvals, and removals. Assessors may also sample user accounts to check assigned roles versus actual duties. They may interview supervisors and staff to confirm practical application, and they'll attempt to identify privilege creep. These are users accumulating more permissions than needed. Okay, what other types of evidence may be required for assessment? What will that assessor review? We talked about access control policy. This includes many of the access control aspects, including least privilege. System security plan, we haven't talked so much about that. This explains, beyond the policy, how, in this case, for least privilege, how role-based access control is enforced. That will be specifically included in 315 control for your system security plan. System or standard operating procedures, onboarding, offboarding, and access review. Assessors will also look at screenshots or exports of role-based access control configurations, group memberships, privileged identity management activity logs. All these screenshots may be requested and looked at for certification or compliance. Access logs. This shows the account activity and deactivation for separated staff. Certainly your assessor will ask for those. Access review results, date-stamped reports or signed review sheets may be requested. And training records, evidence that staff are trained on access procedures and follow least privilege. For GCC, Azure ID, Entra ID, activity logs and access reviews are strong evidence complemented by documented policies. We've repeated many of the key aspects, and they should become second nature. Let's look at the pitfalls and how to avoid them. Some common pitfalls we see during assessments are granting temporary permissions that are never removed, not reviewing access after role or employment changes, lack of documentation or outdated policies, and relying only on technical controls without written procedures. As well, the pitfalls include not leveraging available tools like access reviews. To avoid these problems, automate wherever possible. Schedule reminders for access reviews, and regularly train staff and maintain awareness. This is good advice for each of the 110 controls.